The neighborhood of Pine Grove was quiet that night as it usually was. Street lamps cast soft orange glows across neatly trimmed lawns, and most windows had gone dark hours ago. Most, but not all. In the two-story house at 1487 Maple Street, a single light still burned in the garage. Inside, Tom Wilson wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, careful not to get any motor oil on his face. The 42-year-old electrician had promised his daughter that her bicycle would be fixed by morning, and he wasn't about to break that promise. Their weekend ride had become something of a tradition over the past year. Just the two of them pedaling along the Riverside Trail while his wife slept in on Saturday mornings. Almost done, he muttered to himself, tightening the last bolt on the newly installed chain. Tom stood up slowly, his back aching from hunching over the bike for the last hour. The clock on the garage wall showed 12:17 a.m. He needed sleep, especially with an early job scheduled across town tomorrow, but family always came first. Tom shut off the garage light and made his way through the darkened house, stepping carefully over the creaky floorboard near the kitchen so as not to wake anyone. The home wasn't fancy, a simple 4-bedroom they'd stretched their budget to afford 5 years ago. But it was theirs, and they'd filled it with memories. Upstairs, he peeked into his children's rooms. 10-year-old Lily was sprawled across her bed, one arm dangling toward the floor surrounded by her stuffed animal collection. 7-year-old Ben slept curled up tight like always, blanket pulled all the way to his ears despite the mild spring night. Tom smiled, still amazed sometimes that he'd helped create these little humans. In the master bedroom, his wife Susan lay sleeping. Moonlight through the half-open blinds painted silver stripes across the bed. Tom quietly changed into an old t-shirt and shorts, brushed his teeth, and slid under the covers beside her. Susan stirred slightly but didn't wake. After 15 years of marriage, her presence still brought him comfort. He closed his eyes, thinking about nothing more complicated than weekend plans and whether he'd remembered to buy coffee. Across town, a very different night was unfolding. Officer Mike Reynolds sat in his patrol car, sipping cold coffee and listening to the radio chatter. His shift had been quiet so far, a couple of traffic stops, a false alarm at a convenience store, nothing major. That changed at 12:52 a.m. All units in the vicinity of Maple Street area. We have a 911 call reporting a possible domestic hostage situation. Male subject reportedly armed, threatening family members. Address is 1847 Maple Street. Reynolds sat up straight, dumping his coffee in the process. Domestic calls were always unpredictable, and hostage situations were the worst kind. He radioed, in that he was responding, already flipping on his lights as the dispatcher continued providing details. Caller reports hearing screaming and what sounded like gunshots, unable to make direct contact with residents. Within minutes, 4 patrol cars and a tactical unit were converging on the area. Sergeant Dave Howell took command as they gathered a block away from the target house. "All right, we're treating this as an active threat situation," Howell told the assembled officers, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Reynolds and Parker, you'll approach from the back. Johnson and Cruz take the perimeter. Tactical will make entry through the front." The officers nodded grimly, checking their gear. These situations could go bad in countless ways, and everyone knew it. Reynolds felt the familiar tightness in his chest, part fear, part focus, that came with high-risk calls. Dispatch crackled over their radios again. "Be advised, caller reports hearing a child crying. Exercise extreme caution." That changed everything. Howell's face hardened as he adjusted the plan. "We can't wait for negotiators. If there are kids in danger, we move now." What none of them knew was that in the rush to respond, a critical error had occurred. The 911 operator, in transferring information to dispatch, had transposed 2 numbers in the address. Instead of 1847 Maple Street, the officers were heading to 1487 Maple Street, the Wilson family home. As the officers moved silently through the neighborhood, Tom Wilson was finally drifting off to sleep after a long day. The house was peaceful, with only the occasional creak of settling wood and the soft breathing of his family breaking the silence. Officer Reynolds and his partner crept along the side of what they believed was the correct house. Through an uncovered window, they could see only darkness inside. "No movement," Reynolds whispered into his radio. At the front of the house, the tactical team was in position, gearing up for a dynamic entry. Sergeant Howell gave a final check to the address scribbled on his notepad, 1487 Maple Street. It matched the number on the mailbox. "Confirm address," he whispered into his radio. "Confirmed," came the response from dispatch. 1487 Maple, Howell signaled to his team. They were going in. Inside, Tom Wilson suddenly woke, though he wasn't sure why. Some noise, maybe, or just one of those strange moments when sleep releases its hold for no apparent reason. He lay still, listening. There, a sound outside, not quite natural. Footsteps? He sat up slowly. Susan stirred beside him. "What is it?" she mumbled. "Probably nothing," Tom whispered. "Go back to sleep." But then came another sound, unmistakable this time, the squeak of their back gate, which they'd been meaning to oil for months. Tom's heart rate picked up. There had been break-ins reported. In the area recently, the Andersons 2 streets over had their place ransacked just last week. Tom slipped out of bed and moved to the window. In the yard below, he caught a glimpse of shadowy figures moving along the side of his house. His mouth went dry. This wasn't nothing. "Call 911, he told Susan, who was now fully awake, eyes wide. "Someone's outside." Susan reached for her phone with shaking hands as Tom moved to their closet. Inside, on the top shelf, was a locked box containing the handgun he'd purchased after the first break-in report started circulating in their neighborhood. He'd taken safety courses, gotten properly licensed, and hoped he'd never need to use it. Tonight, that hope was fading fast. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he loaded the gun. "I'm going to check on the kids," he whispered to Susan, who was speaking quietly into the phone. "Stay here, keep the door locked." "The operator says police are already in the area," Susan whispered back, confused. "They're asking if we're the ones who called earlier." Tom frowned, not understanding, but there was no time to figure it out. If someone was trying to break in, his children were his priority. He stepped into the hallway, closing the bedroom door behind him. Downstairs, the tactical team was preparing to breach. Their information indicated an armed suspect, possibly holding family members hostage. They couldn't risk a prolonged standoff if lives were in immediate danger. "Execute," Howell commanded, and the front door shuddered under the impact of the battering ram. Tom Wilson, halfway down the stairs and hearing the thunderous crash below, felt a surge of panic. These weren't ordinary burglars. This was a violent home invasion. His children were just down the hall from the intruders. "Dad," came a frightened call from Lily's room. "Stay there, honey. Lock your door," Tom shouted, raising his gun and moving toward the sound of splintering wood. The tactical team burst through the door, flashlights mounted on their weapons cutting through the darkness of the unfamiliar house. They'd been briefed to expect an armed, dangerous individual, and their adrenaline was pumping. Officer Reynolds, entering from the rear of the house, heard movement on the stairs. His flashlight beam swung upward, illuminating Tom Wilson, a man he'd never seen before, holding a gun, moving down the stairs toward them. "Police! Drop your weapon!" someone shouted, but in the chaos and confusion, with lights blinding him, and his heart hammering in his chest, all Tom Wilson knew was that armed men had broken into his home where his children slept. He hesitated, trying to process what was happening, his gun still raised defensively. It was a moment that would change everything. For the Wilson family, for the officers involved, and for the Pine Grove community. And it had all started with 2 transposed numbers and a peaceful family home mistaken for something it wasn't. Time seemed to slow down in that dark hallway. Tom Wilson stood frozen on the stairs, his gun still raised, blinded by flashlights and surrounded by shouting. In the split second that followed, 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. His children upstairs, his wife on the phone with 911, and these armed intruders who had just smashed through his front door. "Police! Drop the weapon now!" The command came again, but Tom's brain was struggling to process what was happening. Police? In his house? At 1 in the morning? "I live here," Tom managed to say, his voice cracking with confusion and fear. My kids are upstairs. But the officers saw only what they had been prepared to see. An armed suspect in a house where they believed a violent crime was in progress. Officer Reynolds, positioned at the bottom of the stairs, had his weapon trained directly on Tom. In the tactical team's minds, this man matched the description of their target. Male, armed and posing a potential threat. Final warning. Drop the weapon! Sergeant Howell shouted, his voice echoing through the house. From upstairs came the sound of crying. Ben had woken up and was calling for his father. The sound cut through Tom like a knife. His parental instincts warred with his rising understanding that something had gone terribly wrong. Slowly he began to lower his gun. "That's my son," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Please, there's been some kind of mistake." A loud crash from the kitchen startled everyone. Susan had knocked something over while trying to see what was happening downstairs. The sudden noise in the high-tension environment was like a match to gasoline. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. Tom felt a searing pain in his chest as he was thrown backward by the impact. His gun clattered down the stairs, unfired. As he fell, a strange calmness came over him, along with a single thought. "Take care of them, Susan." Upstairs, Susan screamed as she heard the gunshots. She had been on the phone with the 911 operator, who was trying to understand why police were already at an address where no initial call had been made. The moment she heard the shots, Susan dropped the phone and rushed to her children's rooms, gathering both crying kids into her arms and pulling them into the master bedroom closet. "Mom, what's happening?" Lily sobbed, clinging to her mother. "Where's Dad?" "Shh, stay very quiet," Susan whispered, her whole body trembling as she tried to shield her children with her arms. The sounds from downstairs, shouting, radio static, heavy boots on the floors, were like nothing she'd ever experienced before. Downstairs, the reality of what had just occurred was setting in among the officers. Reynolds stood motionless, his service weapon still extended as other officers rushed to the fallen man. Howell was already calling for an ambulance, his voice tight with the growing realization that something had gone very wrong. "Subject down," he reported into his radio. "We need medical now." Officer Parker knelt beside Tom, checking for a pulse while applying pressure to the wounds. "Stay with us, sir," he urged. But Tom's eyes were becoming unfocused, his breathing shallow and irregular. As the tactical team secured the rest of the ground floor, Reynolds finally lowered his weapon. The adrenaline that had carried him through the breach was draining away, leaving him cold and shaking. He'd fired his weapon before in the line of duty, but never like this. Never with this sickening feeling of doubt creeping in. "Bedroom clear," came a call from upstairs. "We've got civilians, a woman and 2 children. Howell's face went ashen. "Bring them down carefully," he ordered, then turned to Reynolds. "What happened?" But Reynolds couldn't answer. He was staring at the family photos on the wall by the stairs, pictures of the man he'd just shot, smiling with his wife and children at a beach at a birthday party, ordinary moments from an ordinary life. "Sarge," another officer called from the kitchen. "You need to see this." On the kitchen counter was a mail pile, bills, advertisements, and a recent property tax statement clearly addressed to Thomas and Susan Wilson. 1487 Maple Street. Howell picked up the statement with a gloved hand, his stomach dropping as the pieces fell into place. "Check the address again," he ordered into his radio, already knowing what the response would be. While they waited for confirmation, Susan was brought downstairs, a child clinging to each arm. The officers had tried to keep her away from the scene at the bottom of the stairs, but she'd broken free when she caught a glimpse of Tom lying there. "Tom? Oh God, Tom?" she screamed, fighting against the officers who held her back. "Let me go. That's my husband." Lily and Ben were sobbing uncontrollably now, calling for their father. The youngest officer on the scene, barely 2 years on the job, turned away, unable to watch. "The address should be 1847 Maple Street." The dispatcher's voice came through the radio, the professional tone faltering slightly. "Not 1487. The ambulance arrived with wailing sirens that woke the entire neighborhood. Lights came on in surrounding houses, and people in bathrobes and pajamas stepped onto their porches, watching in confusion as paramedics rushed into the Wilson home. Inside, the paramedics worked frantically on Tom. "We're losing him," one said tersely. "We need to move now." They transferred him to a stretcher, still working to stabilize him as they carried him out to the ambulance. Susan broke away from the officers and ran alongside, holding Tom's limp hand. "Please, Tom, please stay with me," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "The kids need you." "I need you." Tom's eyes fluttered open briefly. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then the paramedics were lifting him into the ambulance, telling Susan she could ride along, but the children needed to stay behind. "I can't leave them," she said, looking back at Lily and Ben standing in the doorway, confused and terrified. "I'll stay with them," offered a female officer who had arrived with the second wave of responders. "We'll bring them to the hospital right away." Susan nodded numbly and climbed into the ambulance. As the doors closed, she saw Reynolds standing on the sidewalk, his face a mask of shock and dismay. Their eyes met for a brief moment before the ambulance pulled away. Back at the house, the magnitude of the error was becoming clear to everyone involved. The actual domestic disturbance call at 1847 Maple Street was being handled by another unit, who had arrived to find a drunk couple arguing loudly, but no hostage situation, no weapons, no real danger at all. Howell stood in the Wilsons' kitchen, looking at the children's artwork displayed on the refrigerator, at the family calendar marking dentist appointments and soccer practices, at the half-empty coffee mug Tom had left on the counter before going to bed. Every domestic detail was a fresh indictment of what had just occurred. "How did this happen?" he asked no one in particular, his voice hollow. Reynolds sat on the front steps outside, his head in his hands. His partner stood nearby, unsure what to say or do. Both of their body cameras had captured everything: the breach, the confrontation, the shooting. Those recordings would be reviewed endlessly in the days to come. At the hospital, doctors worked desperately to save Tom's life. Susan sat alone in a cold waiting room, still wearing her pajamas, her bare feet dirty from running across the yard to the ambulance. A hospital chaplain had brought her a cup of tea that now sat untouched on the table beside her. The emergency room doors swung open, and a doctor in blood-spattered scrubs walked toward her. Susan stood up, searching his face for any sign of hope, but finding none. "Mrs. Wilson," he began, his voice gentle but direct, "I'm very sorry." Across town, a police captain was being woken by a phone call that would mark the beginning of a departmental crisis, unlike any in the city's history. By morning, the story would spread, of police officers going to the wrong address, of a father trying to protect his family, of a fatal mistake that could never be undone. And in that sterile hospital room, as Susan collapsed into a chair with a grief too vast to comprehend, the first painful hours of a new reality were beginning, for a family shattered, for officers haunted, and for a community that would soon be asking how such a thing could ever be allowed to happen. Dawn broke over Pine Grove with a cold, gray light that matched the mood hanging over the community. News travels fast in small towns, and by morning most people had heard at least some version of what happened at the Wilson house. Neighbors stood in clusters on their lawns, speaking in hushed tones as they watched police tape flutter around 1487 Maple Street. Inside the hospital's family room, Susan sat with red-rimmed eyes, her body curled protectively around her sleeping children. Lily and Ben had finally collapsed from exhaustion after hours of confusion and tears. A social worker sat nearby, making occasional notes and offering water or coffee that Susan couldn't bring herself to accept. "Mrs. Wilson," a gentle voice said from the doorway. A man in a suit introduced himself as Detective Alan Brooks. "I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions about what happened last night." Susan looked up, her face hollow with grief and shock. "My husband is dead because your officers broke into our home and shot him. What else do you need to know?" The detective shifted uncomfortably. "We're conducting a full investigation. Your perspective is important." "My perspective?" Susan's voice cracked. "My perspective is that Tom was protecting us. That's all he ever did, protect us. And now my kids don't have a father." In a conference room several floors away, Police Chief Richard Garcia was meeting with the department's legal team, internal affairs officers, and a visibly shaken Sergeant Howell. The mood was grim as they reviewed the preliminary reports. "Walk me through it again," Chief Garcia said, rubbing his temples. "How did we end up at the wrong house?" The dispatch supervisor, a veteran named Patricia, played the recording of the original 911 call. The caller had reported a possible domestic situation at 1847 Maple Street, but somewhere between the call and the dispatch to officers, the address became 1487. After the children were asleep, Susan sat at her parents' kitchen table, a cold cup of tea in front of her. Her mother had offered food, but Susan couldn't eat. Her father had suggested she try to sleep, but Susan knew sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she picked up her phone and, for the first time since the hospital had given her Tom's personal effects, she looked at his last text messages to her from the previous day. The mundane exchanges about dinner plans and picking up milk now seemed precious beyond measure. "I love you," his last message read, sent before he'd come home from work yesterday. "See you soon." It was a simple transposition of numbers, Patricia explained, her voice tight with regret. "But we had multiple fail-safes that should have caught this." The caller confirmed the address twice. The dispatcher repeated it back. And then she trailed off, looking at Sergeant Howell, who completed the thought. "And then I failed to properly verify the address before we breached." The room fell silent. Everyone present knew the protocols. Addresses were supposed to be confirmed multiple times, especially in high-risk situations. But in the rush to respond to what they believed was a violent scene with children at risk, corners had been cut, assumptions had been made, and Tom Wilson had paid with his life. "Where is Officer Reynolds?" the chief asked. "On administrative leave as per protocol," the internal affairs representative answered. "He's with the department psychologist now." Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Mike Reynolds sat across from Dr. Lin Chen, the department's trauma counselor. He hadn't slept. His uniform had been taken as evidence, so he wore borrowed clothes that hung loosely on his frame. "I keep seeing his face," Reynolds said, staring at his hands. "Right before I fired." He was confused. "He was trying to tell us something." Dr. Chen nodded, letting him continue. "I've responded to hundreds of calls, domestic situations, break-ins, assaults. I've had to draw my weapon before." Reynolds looked up, his eyes red. "But this," he was just protecting his home. His kids were upstairs. "You were operating on the information you had," Dr. Chen said carefully. Reynolds shook his head. "That's what everyone keeps saying. But I pulled the trigger. Me. Not bad information. Not the dispatcher. Me." Back at the hospital, Susan's parents had arrived to help with the children. Her father, a retired factory worker named Joe, held Ben on his lap while the boy slept fitfully. Her mother, Nancy, sat with an arm around Susan, who was trying to make impossible decisions about funeral arrangements and immediate next steps. "You and the kids will come stay with us for a while," Nancy said, brushing hair from Susan's face like she had when Susan was a child. "You shouldn't be alone right now." Susan nodded absently, her mind still struggling to process everything. Just 24 hours ago, her life had been normal. Tom had kissed her goodbye in the morning before heading to work. They had talked about weekend plans. He had promised to fix Lily's bike. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A woman in a dark suit introduced herself as Andrea Powell from the mayor's office. "Mrs. Wilson, on behalf of the city, I want to express our deepest condolences," she began. "Condolences?" Susan's father stood up abruptly, careful not to wake Ben. "Your police officers killed my son-in-law in his own home." "Condolences doesn't begin to cover it," Andrea nodded, accepting the anger. "You're right, sir. Nothing I say can make this right. I'm here because the mayor wants you to know that there will be a full, transparent investigation, and the city will cover all expenses, medical, funeral, anything you need right now. What we need is Tom back," Susan whispered. Outside the hospital, a small crowd had gathered. Word had spread through social media, and community members were holding a vigil for Tom. Some carried hastily made signs. "Justice for Tom Wilson" and "Police Accountability Now." Local news crews had arrived, setting up cameras and trying to get statements from anyone who would talk. A reporter cornered a neighbor of the Wilsons, a retired teacher named Bill Thompson. "Did you know the family well?" Bill nodded, his face solemn. "Tom was the kind of neighbor everyone wants. Always the first to help when someone needed it. When my wife was sick last winter, he cleared our driveway after every snowfall without being asked. Their kids play with my grandkids. They're good people. This shouldn't have happened to them." As the day wore on, more details about the incident leaked to the press. The body camera footage hadn't been released yet, but sources within the department had confirmed that Tom Wilson was shot while holding a legally owned firearm, that he had made no threatening moves toward officers, and that the address mix-up was the result of human error. By evening, The crowd outside the hospital had grown. Community leaders arrived, including Pastor David Lee from the church the Wilsons occasionally attended. "We're here to support this family," he told reporters, "and to demand answers. This isn't about attacking the police. It's about making sure a tragedy like this never happens again." Inside the mayor's office, Mayor Helen Ross was in crisis mode, meeting with the police chief and city council members. The political implications were unavoidable, but more pressing was the human cost and the community response. "We need to get ahead of this," the mayor's chief of staff advised. "Make a strong statement, announce policy changes, show we're taking this seriously." Mayor Ross shook her head. "A man is dead. 2 children have lost their father. Let's focus on supporting that family first, then we'll address policies." At the Wilson home, crime scene investigators were finishing their work. Yellow evidence markers dotted the entryway and stairs where the shooting had occurred. Photographers documented everything: the splintered doorframe, the location where Tom's body had fallen, the gun he had dropped. Detective Brooks stood in the living room, looking at family photos. One showed Tom teaching Ben to ride a bike. Another captured a family camping trip, all 4 Wilsons smiling in front of a tent. The ordinary happiness of these moments made the detective's chest ache with the weight of what had been lost. His phone rang, the lab with preliminary ballistics results. 3 shots fired, all from Officer Reynolds' weapon. 2 had struck Tom in the chest, the 3rd in his shoulder. Tom's gun had not been fired. It had been fully loaded, the safety on. Every piece of evidence supported what was already becoming clear. This was a man defending his home, not threatening officers. As night fell, Susan finally brought the children to her parents' house. The media had tried to follow them, but hospital security and several uniformed officers had created a protective barrier, allowing them to leave through a side entrance. The children were quiet during the drive, exhaustion and confusion having drained them of questions for now. But Susan knew the hardest conversations were still ahead. How do you explain to a child that their father is gone because of a mistake? How do you help them make sense of something that made no sense at all? At her parents' house, Susan tucked the children into the guest room bed. Lily asked for her stuffed rabbit that was still at home. Ben wanted to know when they could go back to their house. Susan promised they would get Lily's rabbit tomorrow, but she had no answer about going home. The thought of returning to the house where Tom had died made her physically ill. Susan set the phone down, tears streaming silently down her face. In less than 48 hours, her life had been completely shattered, and as she sat in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the sleeping house, one question kept repeating in her mind. How was she supposed to live in a world without Tom? 3 days after Tom Wilson's death, the Pine Grove community gathered at Lakeside Chapel for his funeral. The small church couldn't contain everyone who came to pay their respects. People stood shoulder to shoulder outside, listening to the service through speakers set up on the lawn. Inside, Susan sat in the front row, holding her children's hands. Lily wore a blue dress that Tom had once said made her look like a princess. Ben clutched a small toy car his father had given him for his last birthday. Both children had been quiet all morning, overwhelmed by the somber adults and the strange formality of the occasion. Tom Wilson was a man who lived for his family, Pastor Lee began. A dedicated father, a loving husband, a trusted friend and neighbor. His life was cut tragically short, but the impact he had on those around him will continue. Friends and family members shared stories about Tom coaching his son's t-ball team despite knowing nothing about baseball, about him spending weekends building a treehouse that neighborhood kids still played in, about his readiness to help anyone who needed it. Susan had worried about what to tell her children about the funeral. How do you explain such a ritual to young kids? In the end, she had told them it was a special way to say goodbye to Dad, to remember him together with everyone who loved him. Now, watching their solemn little faces as they listened to stories about their father, she wondered if they understood more than adults gave them credit for. Near the back of the church sat Officer Mike Reynolds, in civilian clothes accompanied by his wife. He had debated whether to come, unsure if his presence would be seen as disrespectful. But in the end, he felt he owed it to Tom and his family to bear witness to the life he had taken. Throughout the service, he kept his eyes down, unable to look at the family in the front row. After the funeral, a reception was held at the community center. People hugged Susan and told her to call if she needed anything. They slipped casserole recipes into her hands and promised to check in on her. The support was genuine but overwhelming, and Susan found herself stepping outside for a moment of quiet. On the community center steps, she unexpectedly came face to face with Officer Reynolds, who was also seeking a moment alone. There was an awkward pause as they recognized each other. Reynolds looked as though he might turn and leave, but then stopped himself. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know nothing I can say will change what happened or bring your husband back, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am." Susan looked at him for a long moment. This was the man who had pulled the trigger. In her darkest moments of grief, she had hated him, had imagined screaming at him, asking how he could have been so careless with her family's life. But now, seeing him up close, the haunted look in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly, she felt the complicated truth that there were no simple villains in this story. "My husband was a good man," she finally said. "He would never have hurt anyone who wasn't threatening his family." "I know that now," Reynolds replied, his voice breaking. "We got it wrong. I got it wrong, and I'll live with that for the rest of my life." Susan nodded, suddenly too tired to say more. She turned and went back inside to her children, leaving Reynolds standing alone on the steps. The next day, Mayor Helen Ross held a press conference on the steps of City Hall. The police chief stood beside her, along with several city council members. A forest of microphones captured her words as she addressed the growing controversy. "First and foremost, the city of Pine Grove extends its deepest condolences to the Wilson family," she began. "What happened to Tom Wilson was a terrible tragedy that should never have occurred. Today, I am announcing several immediate actions." She outlined a series of reforms: mandatory address verification protocols, enhanced training for high-risk entries, an independent review of dispatch procedures, and a complete overhaul of the department's use of force policies. Additionally, she continued, I have accepted the resignation of Sergeant David Howell, who was in command during the incident. Internal Affairs has completed its preliminary investigation, and Officer Michael Reynolds has been placed on unpaid leave pending potential disciplinary action or criminal charges, which will be determined by the district attorney's office. At home, watching the press conference on TV, Susan turned it off before the mayor finished speaking. None of these announcements would bring Tom back. Policy changes and resignations couldn't fill the empty space in their beds. Couldn't answer Lily's questions about when Daddy was coming home. Couldn't help Ben stop having nightmares about men breaking down their door. Later that afternoon, Susan met with Frank Murphy, an attorney specializing in wrongful death cases. Her parents had urged her to seek legal advice, and though it felt strange to be discussing lawsuits while she was still numb with grief, she knew she needed to protect her children's future. Based on what we know so far, you have a very strong case against the city, Murphy explained, reviewing the notes he'd taken. The address error, the failure to properly verify before entry, the use of deadly force in a situation where no crime was actually taking place. These all point to gross negligence. Susan stared out the office window. What does that mean for my kids? It means financial security, Murphy said gently. It means the city paying for their education, for therapy, for whatever they need growing up without their father. It also means accountability, making sure the department follows through on those reforms the mayor announced. Susan nodded slowly. How long will it take? Cases like this can sometimes drag on for years, Murphy admitted. But given the clear-cut nature of the errors made and the public pressure, the city might be motivated to settle quickly. I'll do everything I can to make this process as painless as possible for you and your family. As Susan left the lawyer's office, her phone buzzed with a text from her mother, who was watching the kids. News vans outside the house again. Maybe stay away a bit longer? Susan sighed. The media attention had been relentless. Reporters called constantly, showed up at her parents' house, even approached Lily outside her school before teachers intervened. The family's tragedy had become a national news story, with talking heads debating police practices and use of force on every channel. She texted back that she would go to the grocery store first and headed that way. In the store, she kept her head down but still noticed people watching her, whispering to each other. Was that her? The widow from the news? She abandoned her half-filled cart and left. At the police station, Chief Garcia was meeting with his command staff about implementing the new protocols. The mood was tense. Some officers felt Reynolds was being sacrificed to appease public anger. "We need to be clear about something," the chief said, sensing the undercurrent of resentment. What happened to Tom Wilson wasn't just a tragedy. It was a failure on multiple levels, and it could have been prevented. These new procedures aren't punishment. They're protection for civilians and for you. I don't ever want another officer to go through what Reynolds is going through. That seemed to land with most of the officers present. They had all seen Reynolds in the days since the shooting. The weight loss, the sleepless nights, the look of a man being eaten alive by guilt. None of them wanted to be in his position. 2 weeks after the funeral, Susan finally returned to the family home on Maple Street. She had been putting it off staying with her parents, but eventually decided she needed to face it, both to gather more of the children's things and to begin deciding whether they could ever live there again. Her brother Jack came with her for support. They stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, looking at the house. The police tape was gone, but Susan could still see the damaged front door frame, hastily repaired but clearly broken. "You don't have to do this today," Jack said, squeezing her shoulder. "Yes, I do," Susan replied, taking a deep breath and walking up the path. Inside the house was eerily quiet. Mail had piled up inside the door. A jacket Tom had hung on the banister still hung there. In the kitchen, dishes from their last family dinner together were still in the drying rack. Susan moved slowly through the rooms, touching things, remembering. In the garage, she found Lily's bicycle, fully repaired, the last thing Tom had worked on before coming to bed that night. Susan ran her hand along the handlebars, thinking about how Tom had stayed up late to fix it, how he had never broken a promise to his kids. Upstairs, she gathered clothes, toys, and books for the children. In the master bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed, looking at Tom's nightstand. His reading glasses, a half-read thriller, a glass of water, all untouched since that night. Susan picked up his pillow and held it to her face, breathing in the fading scent of him. Jack found her there, curled around the pillow, finally letting herself break down completely. He sat beside her, saying nothing, just being present with her grief. That evening, as Susan tucked the children into bed at her parents' house, Ben asked the question she had been dreading. "Are we ever going back to our real home?" Susan smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "I don't know, sweetie. Would you want to?" Ben thought about it. "I miss my stuff. And the treehouse. But I'm scared the bad men will come back." "They weren't bad men," Susan said carefully. "They were police officers who made a very big mistake. They went to the wrong house." "But they hurt Dad," Lily said from the other side of the bed. "Yes, they did," Susan acknowledged, and that was very, very wrong. But it was still a mistake. They thought they were helping someone else. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to make this distinction for her children. Perhaps because she didn't want them to grow up afraid of police, or because, despite everything, she believed Tom would have wanted them to understand the difference between malice and terrible, fatal error. As she turned out the light, Susan realized she had been living moment to moment since Tom's death, just trying to get through each day. But now, watching her children drift towards sleep, she knew she would eventually need to find a path forward. For herself and, more importantly, for them. What that path would look like she couldn't yet imagine, but for the first time she allowed herself to believe that there would be one. 6 months after Tom Wilson's death, the leaves in Pine Grove had changed and fallen. The town had moved on in many ways, but for those closest to the tragedy, time had a different quality, simultaneously crawling and racing by. Susan sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as Officer Mike Reynolds pleaded guilty to negligent homicide. The district attorney had initially considered more serious charges, but ultimately offered a plea deal. Reynolds would serve no prison time but would receive 5 years of probation, lose his police license permanently, and perform 500 hours of community service. As the judge accepted the plea, Susan felt no satisfaction, no sense of justice being served. Reynolds looked thinner than at the funeral, his face gaunt, eyes hollow. She recognized the signs of grief and guilt. She saw them in her own mirror every morning. Outside the courthouse, reporters thrust microphones toward Susan as she tried to leave quietly. "Mrs. Wilson, Do you think justice was served today? Are you satisfied with the sentence? Will you pursue further legal action against the city? Susan stopped, suddenly tired of avoiding them, of having others speak for her while she remained silent. My husband is dead because of a mistake that should never have happened, she said, her voice steady. No court decision can fix that. My children will grow up without their father. Officer Reynolds will live with what he did for the rest of his life. Nobody won today. With that, she walked to her car, ignoring the shouted follow-up questions. Her lawyer, Frank Murphy, caught up with her at the parking lot. You did great in there, he said, and I have good news. The city's attorney called this morning. They want to settle. Susan leaned against her car. How much? $4 million, Murphy replied. Plus college funds for both kids. And they'll rename the community center after Tom. 6 months ago, such a sum would have seemed unimaginable to Susan. Now it just felt like cold compensation for something priceless. Will it be public? She asked. The settlement amount? Murphy shook his head. We can keep the financial details confidential if you prefer. Just the community center naming would be public, Susan nodded. Good. I don't want the kids growing up with everyone knowing. Like they're the $1 million tragedy children or something. As she drove home, Susan thought about how their lives had changed. They had moved back into the house on Maple Street 3 months ago. It had been a difficult decision, but in the end she couldn't bear to sell the home Tom had loved where they'd built their life together. They'd renovated the entryway and staircase where the shooting happened, changing the layout enough that it didn't trigger memories every time they walked through. The kids were doing better too. Lily had started seeing a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, and the night terrors had mostly subsided. Ben still asked about his dad almost daily, but the questions had shifted from, when is Dad coming back? To would Dad like this Lego spaceship I built? Susan pulled into the driveway, noticing the fresh paint on the front door, a project she'd finally completed last weekend. Inside, her mother was watching the kids, who were building a fort out of couch cushions and blankets. How did it go? Her mother asked quietly. It's over, Susan replied. At least that part of it. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Susan sat on the back porch with a glass of wine. She had taken to spending quiet moments here, looking at the stars and sometimes talking to Tom in her mind. Tonight she told him about the court case, about the settlement, about how Ben had lost his first tooth that morning. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jack. Saw the news. You okay? News traveled fast. The court case had been the top story on the local station. Susan texted back, I'm fine. Coming over for dinner Sunday? Normal life. That's what she was trying to rebuild, one small piece at a time. The next morning, Susan dropped the kids at school and drove to her new job at the library. She had worked part-time at a dental office before Tom died, but couldn't face going back. The library position had come at just the right time. Quiet, steady work that gave her purpose without overwhelming her still fragile emotional state. As she shelved books, her mind kept returning to the settlement. $4 million. It would secure their future financially. The kids' education, the mortgage paid off, no worries about basic needs. But it felt strange, almost wrong, to benefit financially from Tom's death. She had told Murphy to put most of it in trust for the children, to be accessed when they were older. During her lunch break, Susan walked to the park across from the library. She sat on a bench watching people go about their everyday lives. Joggers, mothers with strollers, older couples walking hand in hand. 6 months ago, she couldn't imagine ever feeling normal again. Now she had moments, brief, precious moments, when grief wasn't the first thing she felt upon waking. Her phone rang, an unfamiliar number. Susan almost didn't answer, wary of more reporters, but something made her pick up. Mrs. Wilson, this is Patricia Hall. I was the dispatch supervisor on duty the night your husband died. Susan's breath caught. She had heard the name during the investigation, but had never spoken to the woman. I know this is unexpected, Patricia continued, her voice wavering slightly. I've thought about calling you for months. Today, after seeing the news about Officer Reynolds' sentencing, I finally found the courage. I need to tell you how sorry I am. It was my responsibility to make sure the address was verified. I failed at my job, and your husband paid the price. Susan closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest. Why are you calling me now? Because I'm leaving the department, Patricia replied. I've been on administrative duty since it happened, but I can't do it anymore. Every call that comes in, I hear that night in my head. But before I left, I wanted you to know that we've completely changed how addresses are verified. Every number is repeated back and confirmed twice. Officers must visually confirm house numbers before entry. We call it the Wilson Protocol. Susan was silent for a moment, absorbing this. That won't bring Tom back. No, Patricia agreed, her voice breaking. Nothing will. But maybe it will prevent another family from going through what yours has. After they hung up, Susan sat for a long time watching the clouds move across the sky. The Wilson Protocol. Tom would have liked that. The idea that his death had led to changes that might save others. That weekend, Susan took the children to visit Tom's grave. They brought flowers and small stones to place on the headstone, a tradition they had started on their first visit. Lily had written a letter to her dad, which she folded carefully and tucked under one of the rocks. "Do you think Dad can read my letter?" she asked as they walked back to the car. Susan put an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "I think Dad knows what's in your heart, letter or no letter." "I told him about my science project," Lily said, "and how I won the spelling bee. He would have been proud, right?" "He would have been bursting with pride," Susan assured her. He always was. Ben skipped ahead of them, momentarily distracted by a butterfly. At 6 years old, his grief came in waves, sometimes overwhelming him with sadness, other times receding enough for him to be simply a little boy chasing butterflies. That night, Susan found herself digging through boxes in the attic, searching for home videos. She and the kids curled up on the couch, watching footage of Tom teaching Lily to ride a bike, of family vacations at the lake, of Ben's 4th birthday party where Tom had dressed as a superhero. The children laughed at their father's jokes, at his silly dance moves, at the way he always made faces at the camera. He was really funny, Ben said with satisfaction, as if confirming something he'd been worried about forgetting. "He was," Susan agreed. "He made me laugh every single day." Later, after tucking the kids in, Susan found herself looking at her phone, scrolling to a number she'd saved but never used. After a moment's hesitation, she typed a message. "This is Susan Wilson. I've been thinking about our conversation at Tom's funeral. I'm ready to talk more if you are." She hit send before she could change her mind. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed with a reply from Mike Reynolds. "Thank you. Name the time and place." Susan wasn't sure what would come of meeting with the man who had shot her husband. Forgiveness seemed too simple a word for the complex emotions involved. But she had realized something in these past months. Holding on to anger was exhausting, and it didn't honor Tom's memory. He had been a man who believed in second chances, in making things right when mistakes were made. The next morning, Susan drove to the community center for a meeting about the renaming ceremony. The mayor had invited her to speak, and though public speaking terrified her, she had agreed. Tom deserved to be remembered as more than a tragic headline, more than a protocol named after him. As she pulled into the parking lot, Susan noticed the playground Tom had helped build as part of a community volunteer day years ago. Children played there now, their laughter carrying across the morning air. In a year or two, Ben and Lily would be old enough to come here on their own, to walk or bike from their home on Maple Street to the center that would bear their father's name. Life would go on. Not the life she and Tom had planned together, but a life nonetheless. There would be graduations, first dates, college decisions, careers, perhaps even grandchildren someday. Tom would miss all of it, and that knowledge still had the power to bring Susan to her knees with grief. But she was learning to carry that grief alongside hope, to make room for both the sorrow of what was lost and the possibility of what still might be. As Susan walked toward the community center, she thought about the speech she would give at the renaming ceremony. She would talk about Tom, not just how he died, but how he lived. She would tell the community about his laugh, his kindness, the way he could fix anything with duct tape and determination. She would remind them that behind every headline, every statistic, every policy change, there are real people with real lives and real love for one another. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to give Tom's death some meaning, to ensure that he was remembered not just for how he left this world, but for all the ways he made it better while he was here.